I tried to expose Meek Mill, and now my phone rings every night at 3 a.m. I thought digging into his story would be just another job, but then the call started. Silent, just heavy breathing. And with every ring, I knew something was watching me, waiting. I thought I could walk away, but I was wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning, before everything changed. I wasn't supposed to talk about this. I told myself I'd forget, that I'd move on, but I can't. What I saw, what I heard, it's been haunting me ever since. I wasn't some celebrity investigator or paparazzi, just a regular guy who stumbled into something way bigger than I ever imagined. My name's Ethan. I wasn't looking for trouble when I first got into Meek Mill's world. But when the opportunity came knocking, I thought, why not? I thought I could write a piece, maybe even get a couple of exclusive quotes. It was supposed to be harmless, a few interviews, a couple of articles, and then I'd be out. But I didn't know what I was walking into. I had no idea what was lurking behind that veil of fame. This all started back in 2019, when Meek Mill's name was everywhere. You couldn't go a day without hearing about his fight for justice, his wrongful imprisonment, the redemption story everyone was buying into. People loved him. Hell, I even admired him for what he stood for. The more I read, the more I found myself sucked into the narrative. It was powerful. The whole world seemed to be rooting for him. But I didn't care about that. I didn't care about the redemption story. I wanted to know the truth. What was really happening behind the scenes? The stuff no one was talking about. So, when a source reached out to me offering a glimpse into Meek's world, I couldn't resist. A story like that? I couldn't let it slip by. I got the invitation to an exclusive event, Meek's private celebration, the night he was getting released from house arrest. They said it was small, only a few people in the inner circle, just a quiet get-together. But it felt off the moment I stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't put my finger on. People whispered in corners, talking in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the door every few minutes. The whole thing felt too perfect. Like they were waiting for something or someone. Then I saw him. The doorman. At first, I thought he was just another member of the staff, but something about him stuck out. He wasn't wearing the usual uniform, just a black suit, black tie, standing perfectly still by the entrance. He wasn't greeting anyone or checking passes. He was watching every person who came in like he already knew them. But when I looked closer, I saw that something was wrong. His eyes weren't right. There was nothing there, no pupils, no whites, just empty sockets, staring blankly ahead. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was some weird effect of the dim lighting. But the more I looked at him, the more the hair on the back of my neck stood up. He wasn't just still, he was waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something far worse than Meek to step through that door. I tried to focus on the people around me to block it out, but the unease kept growing. People were acting strange. They were looking over their shoulders, keeping to themselves, talking in whispers. Even Meek's closest associates were on edge, like something was looming. I couldn't figure it out. The event itself was supposed to be a celebration, right? But the more I moved through the crowd, the more I realized this wasn't what it seemed. There was no joy here. There was no celebration. There was only waiting. or something, or someone. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just a bystander. I was part of something I didn't understand, something much darker than a simple story. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was being pulled into it. But what happened next took things to a whole new level. The moment I stepped inside, I felt like I was crossing into another world. The first thing that hit me was the music. It was low, almost hypnotic, like a soft pulse in the background, setting the tone for what was supposed to be an intimate gathering. The lighting was warm, golden, dim, but not too dark. Everything was styled just perfectly, too perfect. The sleek furniture, the dark marble floors, the art on the walls. It all felt like a well-curated scene in a movie. Everything was meant to put you at ease, to convince you that you were walking into something exclusive, something meaningful. At least that's what I told myself. I was led through the space by one of the staff, a quiet man in a perfectly pressed suit who never said more than a few words. The walls were lined with high-end art, abstract pieces, sculptures, and frames that looked like they belonged in a high-profile gallery, not a private event. But the more I walked through the space, the more I noticed how the art seemed almost too perfect, too carefully placed. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about control. There was an unsettling symmetry to it all, like nothing here had been left to chance. The people around me were mostly quiet, but I could tell they were eyeing each other. I watched a group of Meek's closest associates standing in the corner talking in hushed tones, their bodies angled away from the crowd. There was a palpable distance between them, an invisible barrier that told me they weren't just guests. They were in charge. As I made my way deeper into the space, I caught snippets of conversation. One person was mentioning the deal. Another was whispering about the next step. Everyone seemed so aware of what was going on, and yet no one dared speak about it openly. It was like some unspoken rule. Everyone was playing their part, acting like they knew their role in this scripted world, but no one dared step out of line. Meek wasn't around yet, but I knew he was supposed to arrive soon. The anticipation was building, but it wasn't the kind of excitement you'd expect for someone who had just been released. There was a tension in the air, a weight that made the whole space feel too controlled, too artificial. The excitement wasn't real. It was like they were waiting for a performance to begin, and they all knew the exact timing of it. I could feel myself becoming part of it, slipping into that rhythm, that sense of artificial calm. I stood near the bar for a while, nursing a drink I barely tasted, trying to fit in. Everyone was talking, laughing, mingling like everything was normal. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how out of place I felt. There was something unnerving about how everyone moved in sync, as if they all knew the unspoken rules of the room, the rules I wasn't privy to. The staff moved fluidly between groups, always hovering just out of view, never staying in one place for too long. It was like they were part of the background, like they belonged there in a way the rest of us didn't. But it wasn't just the staff. Even the guests seemed to fit perfectly into their roles. The men wore sharp suits, the women wore elegant dresses, but there was something off in the way they carried themselves. Their body language was too controlled, too deliberate. No one seemed relaxed. No one was just living in the moment. They were always watching, always waiting for something to happen. I caught a few glances here and there, eyes flicking between me and the others. But it wasn't the friendly, welcoming kind of glance. It was more like the kind of look you give when you're trying to figure someone out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being sized up, but I had no idea why. As I looked around, something about the space began to feel more and more like a stage. The high-end decor, the carefully placed lighting, the music, it all felt designed to manipulate the atmosphere, to make us feel like we were part of something grand. But I couldn't ignore the small details that didn't sit right with me. For example, the way the staff never made eye contact, how the door leading to the back room was always closed, but you could see shadows moving behind it. How, when I turned to look at someone, I'd catch them glancing away too quickly, as if they were hiding something. The most unsettling part was the silence between the people. Everyone was talking, but there was no real communication. It was all surface level, polite conversation, the kind you expect at these types of events. And yet, beneath it all, I could feel the tension. Like every word was carefully measured, every gesture deliberately planned. It was like I was in the middle of a performance, and I had to stay in character. As I walked further into the space, I found a spot where I could observe, taking in the scene. From where I stood, I could see the entire room, the way people were subtly divided into groups, the way some avoided the gaze of others. A few people laughed, but it didn't sound genuine. It was forced, like they were all pretending to be part of a script no one could remember. The closer we got to Meek's arrival, the more it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. I could feel the collective energy shift in the air, and I knew something was about to happen. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But then, I saw it. The door at the back of the room creaked open. It was subtle, like a signal no one else noticed, but I saw it. And that was when the tension in the room really began to change. And that's when everything changed. I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking it, that I was just nervous about being in a room full of high-profile people, all of them waiting for Meek to make his appearance. But as the night dragged on, the feeling that something wasn't right only grew stronger. The small details that should have been inconspicuous were now impossible to ignore, like cracks in a perfectly painted wall, little things that didn't add up. I watched as the guests around me continued their polite conversations, but I could feel the tension in their voices, a nervous energy that couldn't be hidden. A laugh here, a half-hearted comment there. It wasn't real. They weren't really enjoying themselves. I saw it on their faces, a subtle shift in their expressions when they thought no one was looking. It was like they were all playing a part, following a script that had been written long before they arrived. And the more I looked around, the more it seemed like I wasn't supposed to be here. I was an outsider, an intruder in a world I had no business trying to expose. And that's when I noticed it, the first real sign that something was off. One of the guests, a man I hadn't seen before, caught my eye. He wasn't part of the usual crowd, the ones who were there for the celebration. He was different. He was standing alone near the bar, his back to the crowd, but when he turned, his gaze met mine. I'm not sure why, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a glance or even a stare. It was as if he saw me, really saw me, and it wasn't friendly. There was no recognition in his eyes, no curiosity, just coldness. It was quick, just a second, but it felt like an eternity. And the moment it happened, The air around me seemed to thicken, like something had shifted. The strange feeling of being watched, of being out of place, intensified. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I kept seeing him standing there, alone, eyes locked on mine, like he knew something I didn't. And that's when I saw it, his hand, clenched into a fist resting on the bar. It wasn't natural. The way he held himself, the tension in his body, it was like he was waiting for something to happen, and I was a part of it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just a weird encounter, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then I realized it wasn't just the way he looked at me, it was the way he moved. Everything about him was deliberate. The way he took a sip of his drink, the way he stood with his shoulders squared, like he was always prepared for something to happen. And that's when I started to feel it again, that deep, gnawing unease that I couldn't escape. I wasn't just a witness to the night's events. I was part of something I didn't understand, something I wasn't supposed to be involved in. And then, as if the universe had conspired to confirm my fears, I saw something else. It was subtle, but it caught my eye. The man's reflection in the mirror behind the bar, it wasn't quite right. At first I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked closer, I saw it. His reflection wasn't moving in sync with his body. He was standing perfectly still in the mirror, but in real life, his body was subtly shifting as though he was adjusting his stance without any intention to move. The reflection remained frozen, just like his eyes, just like his hand gripping the glass. It was like his reflection was stuck in time, trapped in a moment that hadn't changed, while the real him was doing something entirely different. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was the reflection or my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore it. The dissonance between what I was seeing and what was actually happening was too strong to be dismissed. My heart started to race. I could feel the pulse in my throat, in my temples. I had to look away, but every instinct told me to stay, to keep watching, to figure it out. My gaze shifted back to him, and there it was again. The way he stood, like he was waiting for something specific. Not just waiting for Meek, not for the event to unfold, he was waiting for me. And that thought sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped back, trying to distance myself from the tension in the air. But as I moved away, I noticed something even more disturbing. The guests around me had stopped talking. The chatter had faded into a dull hum, like a radio with no signal. People were still smiling, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes anymore. Everyone was too still, too calculated. It was as though they were all playing a part, their movements too precise, too choreographed. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The entire room was suffocating, and I was in the center of it, surrounded by people who weren't who they appeared to be. The final straw came when I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, slow. They weren't hurried, but they were deliberate. I didn't turn around, but I could feel someone standing just a few inches away. It wasn't the doorman. It wasn't anyone I recognized. I felt their presence before I even looked. When I did turn, there was nothing. No one, but the feeling remained. They were watching. They had always been watching. The dread grew, the realization settling in that the man at the bar, the guests, even the doorman, none of them were what they seemed. and I was right in the middle of something much darker than a simple gathering. I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear had already settled in, like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. Then I saw it, Meek Mill. But it wasn't a grand entrance. It wasn't the joyous moment I had expected. No, he stepped in slowly, his expression cold, unreadable. His eyes locked on mine instantly. And in that moment, I knew something was about to shift. It wasn't just about him being free. It wasn't just about the media or the spotlight. He wasn't here for the celebration. He was here for something else. And as the room went silent, I realized it wasn't just the figure at the bar. It wasn't just the reflection in the mirror. It was all of them. They were all part of something bigger, something darker. And I had unknowingly walked into the heart of it. As I turned away, trying to lose myself in the crowd again, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A door at the far end of the room. It was small, unmarked, tucked away behind a set of heavy curtains. It didn't seem like part of the party. It wasn't an entrance to the main area. And yet, it was there, standing out as if it didn't belong. The crowd was focused on the center of the room, where the conversations were happening, where the excitement was building. But my eyes were drawn to that door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was probably just a storage closet, a room they didn't want to be disturbed. But the more I stared at it, the more it felt wrong. The other rooms in the venue were open, accessible. There was no reason for something to be locked, especially during such a high-profile event. Why wasn't anyone paying attention to it? Why was it hidden behind those curtains, almost like it was intentionally kept out of sight? As I moved closer, I could feel my heart rate quicken. I had no reason to be suspicious, no reason to feel this way. But the closer I got, the more I felt like I was crossing an invisible line. I could hear the murmur of voices around me, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's world. My world had narrowed to this locked door, to the uneasy feeling that something important was hidden behind it. I couldn't explain it, but I had to know what was behind it. I couldn't just walk away. The door was just an ordinary door, plain and unremarkable, but the room around it felt colder, like it was shielding something. There was no handle, just a small latch that kept it shut. But even with the latch in place, I knew. I could feel it. There was something on the other side. Something that didn't belong to the rest of the world that I had entered. Before I could act on the impulse to open it, I felt a presence behind me. A shift in the air, a chill running down my spine. Someone was standing there, watching me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone from the staff, maybe one of the guests checking in on me. But instead, it was the same man, the one who had looked at me earlier, the one I couldn't shake from my mind. His expression hadn't changed. His eyes were still cold, unreadable. But this time, he took a step closer. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge to it that sent a chill through my entire body. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even move. I was caught off guard by the suddenness of it, the intensity of his presence. He wasn't just warning me, though. He was telling me something. I didn't know if it was a threat or a warning, but I knew one thing for sure. He knew something I didn't, and in that moment, I realized I had crossed the line. I was no longer a passive observer. I was part of something bigger, something darker, and I had no idea how deep it went. Without saying another word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. But the unease didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. And that's when I realized what I had stumbled into wasn't just an event. It was a web, and I was caught in it. I wasn't just investigating a story. I had become the story. But that was just the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But it wasn't until I stepped outside the room, away from the locked door, that the weight of the situation really hit me. The entire atmosphere had shifted, like I had stepped out of one world and into another, a world that wasn't mine. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of the night, the weirdness of the event, the strange looks from the guests, the locked door I couldn't stop thinking about. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The energy in the room had changed. The air was heavier, charged, as though something was about to happen. The conversations around me still sounded the same, light, casual, meaningless, but it felt like I was hearing them through a thick veil, like everything was distant and muffled. Even the music, which had been playing in the background, felt off, the notes lingering longer than they should have, like the rhythm was being distorted. The longer I stood there, the more I realized it wasn't just the room, it was the people too. The guests, the staff, even Meek's entourage, they all seemed like they were on edge. They were still smiling, laughing, but there was something in the way they held themselves. It was subtle at first, like an unconscious stiffness in their posture, but it was there. I tried to ignore it. I forced myself to focus on the conversations, the excitement building around Meek's release. He was supposed to be here any minute, and with his arrival, everything would shift back to normal. The energy in the room would snap back into place. The unease would fade. But that didn't happen. Then came the real shock. I was standing near the bar, trying to make sense of everything, when I saw one of the guests, someone I hadn't noticed before, walking toward me. She was a woman, dressed in all black, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair. She was walking slowly, almost deliberately, as though she had all the time in the world. And when she stopped in front of me, she didn't speak right away. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that were too piercing, too intense. I tried to look away, but something about her presence held me in place. The longer I stood there, the more it felt like the world around me was shrinking. I couldn't breathe. I could feel her eyes boring into me, as if she were seeing straight through me. Finally, she spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was soft, but it carried an unsettling weight. It wasn't a warning, not exactly. It was something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my chest. But it was like a cloud, heavy and suffocating, and it wouldn't go away. I tried to focus on the sound of the crowd, on the chatter, the clinking of glasses, but it all sounded distant now. My head was spinning. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I needed to get out of there. I needed air, space, something to ground me. I made my way toward the door, my mind racing. I tried to ignore the way the walls seemed to close in around me, the way the floor beneath my feet felt unstable, like I was walking on shifting sand. Every step I took, the world seemed to grow darker, the air thicker. That's when I heard it. The door to the back room, the one I had been so fixated on earlier, creaked open. The noise was faint at first, but it was enough to draw my attention. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of the staff members entering or exiting the room. But when I looked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stepped into the doorway, and I froze. It wasn't just anyone. It was the doorman, the one with the eyes that weren't there. He had been standing at the entrance when I first arrived, but now he was in the back room, standing in the doorway like he was waiting for something. His body was rigid, like a statue, and his eyes, those eyes, they were locked onto me, empty and lifeless. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. How had he gotten back there? Why was he standing in the doorway watching me? The silence stretched between us. And then, without a word, the doorman stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the room. The door swung shut behind him, but the echo of its slamming shut lingered in the air. I don't know why, but I felt a sudden rush of panic. My heart was pounding in my chest and my hands were shaking. I had to leave. I had to get out of that place. But as I turned to leave, something in the back of my mind stopped me. It was the same feeling I had gotten earlier, the one that had gnawed at me since I first walked into that building. I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. I turned back toward the door. The doorman was gone, but the feeling of his eyes, his empty, hollow eyes, was still there, burning into my soul. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear. But I walked toward the door. I pushed it open just a crack, just enough to peek inside. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a thing. It was a presence. A shape in the darkness just beyond the threshold. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt it. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, if it even had eyes, staring at me, waiting. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the moment as the room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shape vanished. The door slammed shut, and the space around me snapped back into focus. The noise of the crowd, the laughter, the music, it all rushed back in, as if nothing had happened. But it had. Something had happened. And I couldn't explain it. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had just seen, whatever that thing was in that room, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real, and it was connected to Meek Mill, to everything I had been investigating. I should have left right then, but something told me I had already crossed a line I couldn't come back from. The night had started to bleed into the early morning hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The calls had stopped for a few nights, and the unease had started to fade. But as I walked through the crowd, I couldn't ignore the weight pressing on my chest. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the room itself was closing in on me. It should have been a relief. The night had been going on without incident, and Meek was still nowhere to be seen. People were laughing, drinking, pretending to enjoy themselves. But I couldn't shake the sensation that the atmosphere had shifted once again. Something in the air was thick, like it was charged with a power I couldn't see. Something that made every movement feel wrong. The music, which had been loud and vibrant, now felt grating. The words of the songs seemed to echo in my head, too sharp, too hollow. The people around me, with their fake smiles and empty chatter, were no longer just out of place. They were distorted, like actors caught in the wrong scene, trapped in a performance they didn't know how to end. I felt like an intruder again. It wasn't just the place, it was the people. I had become part of something I couldn't understand. I knew I wasn't supposed to be here, but now, leaving didn't seem like an option. I tried to distract myself, tried to focus on the celebratory atmosphere, but it was impossible to ignore the oddity of the situation. The locked door, the strange looks from the guests, the doorman's eyes that weren't eyes at all. It all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle that had just started to form a picture I didn't want to see. Then, as I walked toward the back of the room, something happened. It was subtle at first, just a whisper in the air. I almost thought it was the music or someone talking too loudly, but the moment I heard it again, my heart stopped. It wasn't a voice, not a word, just a low, guttural noise, like a groan that came from deep within the earth, rumbling, vibrating through the floor. The sound reverberated in my chest, too deep to ignore. It wasn't something I could place. It was a sound I had never heard before. Yet I knew instinctively it was wrong. It shouldn't be there. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. No one else seemed to notice. The party continued as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But I felt it. Something had shifted. The air felt colder, denser. I tried to shake it off, tried to keep moving, but every step I took felt like I was being pulled deeper into whatever was unfolding around me. I turned toward the back corner where I saw a figure standing still, facing the wall. They were dressed in black, their figure almost blending into the shadows. It was hard to make out their face from the angle, but I knew instantly that they weren't supposed to be there. I tried to look away, but something kept pulling my gaze back to them. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like they were waiting for me. I couldn't explain it, but it was like they knew I'd be watching, like they were waiting for me to look at them. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. But there was something in the way they stood that sent a cold chill crawling up my spine. I could feel their eyes on me, though they hadn't even turned their head. It was as if they were drawing me in, as if they were inside my mind. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just an observer. I was part of the performance. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the space around me had shrunk. I felt suffocated by it, like I was trapped inside the room with this presence. The world outside, the voices, the laughter, the music, all of it faded into the background. It was just me and this figure standing still like they had all the time in the world waiting for something to happen. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if every motion was premeditated, the figure turned toward me. Their eyes, I couldn't look away from them. They weren't human eyes. There was no light behind them, no depth, just dark, empty voids that seemed to stare right through me. For a split second, I thought I saw something in those eyes. a flicker, a flash of recognition, but then it was gone, replaced by an all-consuming darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figures stepped closer, and as they did, the room seemed to get darker. The lights overhead dimmed slightly, and the hum of the air conditioner, the buzz of the crowd, all faded into nothing. The only sound left was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to cooperate. I was frozen in place. The figure stepped into the light just a few feet away from me, and in the eerie silence that followed, they spoke. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice wasn't human, not in the way I understood it. It wasn't a voice at all, it was more like a thought, something that resonated deep inside my mind. The words didn't make sense. They shouldn't have made sense, but they did. The moment I heard them, I felt a terrible certainty. I had crossed the line. I had looked too far behind the curtain, and now there was no turning back. Before I could respond, the figure vanished. Just like that, in a blink of an eye, they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. I stood there, my heart racing, my legs still frozen. The party continued around me. People laughed, chatted, moved through the space, unaware of what had just happened. But I knew. I knew what I had seen wasn't just in my head. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. And that's when everything changed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The figure was gone, but I couldn't shake the image of those empty eyes staring right through me. The rest of the room around me seemed to spin, as though I had stepped out of time and into something else, something darker, something I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to scream, to run, to get out of there and never look back, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was frozen, my mind locked in a cage, unable to escape the terror that had just unfolded in front of me. My heart hammered against my chest, each beat louder than the last, as if it was trying to break free from the fear that had rooted itself inside me. The music had returned to its previous rhythm. The laughter and chatter around me filled the air again, but it felt distant, like I was hearing it underwater. Everything around me seemed to blur, and yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot where the figure had been standing. The room felt like it had closed in, pressing on me from all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my palms were clammy with sweat. I tried to calm myself, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind. Maybe I'd just imagined it. Maybe I had been too caught up in the atmosphere of the event. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. What I had seen, what I had felt, it was real. It was something I couldn't explain, but it was real. And that thought chilled me to the bone. My legs finally started to work again, but they carried me back toward the bar almost mechanically. I needed to drink something. I needed to feel something familiar, something that could ground me in this strange, overwhelming moment. As I pushed through the crowd, I could feel their eyes on me, just like they had been earlier. They were still watching, still waiting for something. But what was it? What were they waiting for? Me or something else? I grabbed a glass of water, my hands trembling as I took a sip, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. The image of that figure, those dark, empty eyes, kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. It was like I could still feel those eyes on me, even though the figure was long gone. The feeling of being watched, of being part of something I didn't understand, had only intensified. As I stood there, trying to steady myself, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned quickly, heart racing in my chest, expecting someone from the staff, maybe one of the other guests, but instead, I was met by the last person I ever expected to see. It was the doorman, the same one who had watched me when I first arrived, the one whose eyes had been empty. He was standing right there, his face expressionless, his posture rigid as always. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. They weren't just empty, they were cold. And as he looked at me, it felt like he was staring into my very soul, like he could see everything I had hidden, everything I was afraid to admit to myself. "You should leave," he said, his voice low, barely a whisper, but it felt like a command. I froze, unable to respond. The words didn't make sense, and yet they did. He wasn't just telling me to leave the party. He was telling me to leave the entire situation, to walk away from whatever I had just uncovered. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without answers. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible over the din of the party. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his gaze never wavering, the silence between us stretching on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You're in too deep now. You're part of this. There's no turning back." The words hit me like a slap. Part of this? What was he talking about? What had I gotten myself into? I had come here to uncover a story, to expose something I thought needed to be known, but now it felt like I had walked into something I was never supposed to see, and now I couldn't escape. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but my throat felt tight, and I couldn't find the words. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late, before whatever this was consumed me completely. I turned to walk away, but before I could make it 2 steps, I felt a hand on my arm. A cold, firm grip that stopped me dead in my tracks. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing in front of me, was the same guest I had seen earlier. The one who had looked at me in the bar with those unsettling eyes. He was holding a phone in his hand, and he raised it slowly, as if it was part of some ritual I wasn't meant to understand. "I told you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have looked." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there, stunned, the fear slowly creeping back into my veins like poison. I could feel it, the weight of their presence, the darkness that was pulling me in deeper. My mind was racing. What was happening? Why was I being dragged into this? I had uncovered a story, yes, but now it felt like it was no longer about exposing the truth. It was about surviving the truth. I had crossed a line I wasn't prepared for. And now, no matter how much I wanted to run, there was no escape. I tried to calm myself, tried to rationalize everything, but the feeling of dread only deepened. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears, louder and louder. It was like everything around me was closing in, suffocating me. The fear wasn't just psychological anymore. It was physical, crawling under my skin, into my bones. I could feel it in the air, pressing against me from all sides. I needed to get out, but every step I took, every move I made, felt like I was being drawn back in,
deeper into this dark, twisted world I didn't understand.
But what happened next took things to a whole new level. I thought once I exposed the truth, the calls would stop. But the truth never lets you go. It follows you, waits for you. And now, every time I close my eyes, I feel them getting closer. If I vanish, if my voice goes silent, you'll know what happened.
But don't think you're safe. They're already watching you, too.